Slavery in Ancient Rome by Delaney Whitney and Nick B.
Some slaves in ancient Rome were farmers. The slaves produced food and other materials that the city depended on. The slaves gathered wheat, olives, vines, and grapes for their masters.
The slaves were usually prisoners of war. Sailors captured them and sold by pirates, or the slaves could be bought outside Roman territory. When slaves were captured in battle, they were brought back to Rome.
Roman slaves had many roles and jobs. The slaves' jobs began at daybreak, then they would walk their masters' children to school, clean the villa, wash clothes, clean up a garden, and help dry their master if they took a bath at home.
When children were abandoned, they were brought up as slaves. Slaves couldn't marry legally, but when they did, their kids automatically became slaves. Slaves and their families were property of the masters. If their masters wanted to, they could split up the slave family.
The slaves failed at their jobs, the masters worked them. The masters were very cruel, kind, or indifferent. Every master was different. Masters would whip, brand, or cruelly mistreat slaves if they ran away.
Slaves were vital to the Roman economy and social fabric of the society. The more slaves the Romans had, the richer they were. Slaves were sold to make money for poor citizens. The upper-class Romans had dozens or even hundreds of slaves. Middle-class slaves had 1 to 3 slaves.
The worst job a slave could have was working in the mines. Slaves would also help repair aqueducts, build roads, and other buildings. Slaves would also be carpenters and or blacksmiths who repaired farm tools and carts. Others watched cattle, sheep, and pigs.
When a slave was beat by their master, it was still accepted in Rome. Slaves got their identity from their master. Romans thought of it as a process rather than a permanent condition. Slaves were thought of property and not necessarily people.
Slaves were sold at the market, or also called the agora. The price for slaves varied on their trades and abilities. Public slaves were owned by the state and private slaves were owned by individuals.
Slaves in ancient Rome received wages to gain enough money to gain their freedom. Another way slaves got their freedom was if their owners gave it to them. Giving a slave their freedom wasn't a way to just get rid of the slave. The masters really meant it.